Good morning, YouTube. We are going to get Instagram. Good morning. We have YouTube here and we have Instagram rolling. Welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Ellison Melrose. I am one of the teaching assistants for clinical management of the fitness athlete pregnancy and postpartum. What I wanted to come to you today to discuss was creatine. But before we get into that, I want to go over a couple of the upcoming courses that we have. So we just started our online cohort about 2 weeks ago. So the next one doesn't start until November 1st. So if you're looking to get some education around managing pregnancy and postpartum athletes, we have 3 upcoming live courses over the next couple weeks. So next weekend, September 24th, Alexis and Jess will be in Hendersonville, Tennessee. October 1st, Christina and Jess will be in Baton Rouge. And then October 8th and 9th, Alexis and myself will be in Maryland, Germantown, Maryland. So if you are looking to get into one of these courses, head on over to ptonice.com and check them out. And we're excited to see you guys on the road. So the reason why I wanted to talk to you guys about creatine is because at our most recent on our live course in Fenton, Michigan, a question came up about what is creatine, why we should use it, and its efficacy and safety around pregnancy and postpartum. So while there's not a ton of research in this area ever during pregnancy and postpartum, there have been a lot of research that has been synthesized from animal studies. And in 2021, there was a review of all of the literature that is out there on both human and animal studies. And so I wanted to kind of dive into that a little bit today and talk about creatine metabolism during female reproduction, pregnancy, and then potential usage for supplementation of creatine during pregnancy for newborn health. So the study or the review that I am referring to, I will post it in the description. It was looking at trying to determine the relationship between creatine use and if it would be protective against fetal hypoxia. So that's been something that has been hypothesized in the literature. But if we can kind of take a step back and just start with talking about what is creatine and how it's used in our body. And creatine is one of the most well-researched supplements to date. That and caffeine probably have the most research in usage during exercise and performance enhancement. So what is creatine? Creatine is an amino acid, and it's the building block for the most rapidly produced mitochondria energy. So it helps with creation of ATP in the mitochondria, and we can create creatine through a process within our liver, and we create about 1 gram per day of creatine. Exogenous creatine is typically found in our diets in animal products. So anything with meat, fish, and dairy will typically contain creatine. And then there's been a lot of supplementation with creatine used for improving exercise tolerance and our ability to create energy during exercise. So within the female reproductive system, if you can imagine, a lot of energy goes into creating new life, right? So an oocyte, or an immature egg, requires a ton of energy during the fertilization process. And the research that has been done to date has all been done on, again, animal studies. So we're synthesizing these from research done on mice and in the bovine literature as well. But what they have found is that creatine metabolism occurs rapidly in these immature eggs, and it's really important to have this energy availability for the fertilization of this oocyte. What they also have found is that not only is that immature egg, but the follicle in which that oocyte is transported in, there is a lot of creatine that is found within the follicular fluid, so the follicle that contains the oocyte. What they're unable to determine is if this is endogenous, so if this is created within the follicle, or if it is from cellular reuptake. So if that would be something that would be dietary and then taken up into the follicle and oocyte. What they have found in animal studies is that the creatine found in this follicular fluid is actually increases during ovulation. So really cool to see that, during ovulation, we have this peak in requirement of creatine. Could creatine supplementation facilitate ovulation in humans? Again, there's been no studies to date on this. I'm just synthesizing this from the animal studies that we have. So the next step, so once we have an oocyte, it releases from the follicle and becomes a mature egg. And during that process, the next step would be fertilization of that egg. So some of the animal studies that have been done see that there's this increase in creatine in the reproductive tract during fertilization. And what they have theorized is that this creatine in the reproductive tract is absorbed and taken up by the sperm, which then increases their hyperactivity and the likelihood of successful fertilization. So the increase during ovulation, that increase that we see in the follicle and then release of the egg, that increase in creatine helps with the fertilization of the egg. So again, could supplementation of creatine improve the likelihood of fertilization? There's no studies that have been done on humans yet, but again, just synthesizing this and trying to, wrap our heads around where the research could go. The next step in the fertilization process would be the implantation of the fertilized egg into the endometrium, or the uterine lining. While it's not well understood, again, none of this is really well understood, particularly in humans, there is a high level of the creatine kinase chain reaction to create energy. It's highly active in the uterine tissue throughout the reproductive cycle and during pregnancy. And what they have found is during the menstrual cycle, the secretory phase, where that embryo would implant into the uterine wall, there is an upregulation in creatine. And so what they have synthesized is that the production of ATP from this reaction may be necessary for that receptive phase. So for that the uterine lining to uh, facilitate that implantation of the egg, the creatine and ATP that is created through creatine is required. And what they have found in some studies in mice is that the decreased creatine within that endometrial lining is linked to reduced fertility in mice. So again, could we tap into creatine to improve people that maybe live in that subfertility or lower fertility windows? Could creatine supplementation help with that? Again, someone wants to do the research on that. That's the next step. So during pregnancy, what we find is the placenta is a huge house for creatine, and it takes and creates a lot of energy, obviously, to help support the fetus during that 9 to 10 months of pregnancy. And what they're showing is that the placenta actually can synthesize creatine. But again, is this something that is enough to support the during the fetus during that entire pregnancy? What they have found is that during hypoxic states or during parts of pregnancy where there's maybe decreased oxygen, so where they may see this is preeclamptic episodes, gestational diabetes, or anytime where there's been a fetal growth restriction, oftentimes that's surrounded by this hypoxic state. It's often correlated with inadequate placental perfusion, which can be linked towards decreased creatine, the creatine kinase circuit. So what's creating that energy is this, in that hypoxic state, would be the creatine release of energy or use of creatine to create ATP in that hypoxic state. So again, what they're showing is that potentially supplementation of creatine during pregnancy could help reduce the likelihood of suboptimal fetal outcomes due to anything that creates this hypoxic state. So where they saw this in human studies is actually those that live at higher altitude where oxygen is reduced, and they saw that there was an increase in creatine usage in pregnancies that were at those higher altitudes. During preeclamptic states, what they find is that the creatine content in the placenta has been reported to increase by 38%. So again, this kind of just shows that when we are in those hypoxic states during, or the placenta is in a hypoxic state during pregnancy, we rely a lot more heavily on this rapidly produced energy through the creatine kinase circuit. So I feel like I am quickly running out of time here, but we'll continue on because there's a lot of really cool stuff coming up. So there was a case study done with a woman who had a deficiency that decreased her ability to synthesize creatine. So she wasn't able to produce endogenous creatine, or at least enough for to support the placenta during pregnancy. And what they saw during that case study is there was actually a reduction in fetal growth. And they saw this during a mid-gestational ultrasound. They then increased her creatine intake from 2 grams to 3 grams. And she went on to deliver a healthy weight baby at 35 weeks gestation. And they tracked that baby over the next year, and all of the developmental milestones were hit in um, that baby. So it's really cool to see that although this is one person, they did implement that creatine supplementation, and they saw that fetal growth restriction that was occurring was no longer occurring by the termination of her pregnancy at 35 weeks. So let's kind of review everything that we've gone over today. Before we do that, I do want to touch on one thing is that, what 35 weeks of gestation is pretty important during these creatine studies, and that's because the preterm babies, they don't have the renal and pancreatic processes or maturity to create endogenous creatine on their own. And so they rely a lot more heavily on the placental transfer of creatine for creation of ATP. And so that's why it's super important to try and get these babies to that 35-week mark, because what they have seen is that those preterm babies that develop this creatine deficiency in that early first 2 weeks of life is that they can go on to develop decreased psychomotor function and seizures. And so what they saw with using creatine supplementation in some of these preterm babies is that they were able to reduce neurological disorders and reduce the likelihood of seizures when supplementing with creatine in preterm babies. So just to kind of sum everything up, creatine plays a huge role in reproductive health, particularly for successful fertilization or implantation in the uterine wall. It's unclear the importance of creatine within the uterus during the menstrual cycle or during pregnancy. There hasn't been a ton of research done on that. But what they have seen, particularly in animal studies, is that creatine deficiencies can be linked to suboptimal fertility. And so it's thought that potentially supplementing with creatine can help improve that fertility. During pregnancy, the hypoxic states that reduce creatine metabolism, would be another important time to supplement with creatine to reduce or protect the placenta from, or to improve the placental transfer of creatine to the babies or fetus. And particularly to reduce likelihood of developing anything that would be caused from creatine deficiency for that early or preterm baby. So while there's not a ton of literature out there on this in humans, we can take some of these animal studies and try and synthesize this and try and use this in our role in helping these, women and everyone through their reproductive health by increasing their creatine, exogenous creatine. So whether that be improving their diet to include more foods that are high in creatine, or finding a reputable supplement brand to supplement with. What they're showing is that there's no indication that creatine supplement that's been created in a high quality manufacturing poses any risk or adverse side effects in women of reproductive age or preterm infants. So making sure that the supplements that we are using are high quality is also important, but there has been no research to show that that would do any damage towards female reproductive system or those preterm babies. So that's all we have today. I went a little bit over, but if you guys have any other questions about this study, again, I'll link it, or I'll put the article down in the description below. So if you have any other questions, feel free to comment down below, and I will look forward to the conversation. Have a good day. Bye.